500% tariffs, secondary tariffs on countries importing Russian energy and commodities, it would stop the Russian economy. It would absolutely crash the Russian economy because they only export commodities. It's like 80% of export revenues are commodities, right? And no one would be able to afford to buy those exports. I mean, the problem is with that, unfortunately, that it clearly will cause a lot of disruption to global markets, right? Russia is, I think, about 9-10% of global oil exports, so there'll be a significant energy price shock, oil price shock, if that happens. I mean, I think the idea, the 500% tariff idea, is it's all part of building leverage on Putin. We're serious. We're threatened to do this. Come to the negotiating table. It's two-pronged, right? It's arm Ukraine and increase the threat and risk of sanctions. The problem is Trump has already undermined all that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by economist Timothy Ash, an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. Tim, welcome back.
My pleasure to be here.
Well, we have heard this morning about the new round of EU sanctions that were approved yesterday after Slovakia allowed the round of sanctions to go through. What should we make of those sanctions? Are they going to have a bigger impact than previous rounds?
Well, it's the 18th round of sanctions, which kind of says something anyway, right? I mean, there's been no decisive blow. It's been kind of incremental. It's a cat and mouse game, really. I mean, every time the West imposes some sanctions, the Russians figure out ways to get around it, right? So part of this new sanctions kind of package is, again, reacting to what Russia's done and tightening up a bit. And you can see some of the things there, right? I mean, there's a reduction of the oil price cap from 60 to, I think, 46. Again, the Russians had figured out ways of getting around it, so it's kind of with a shadow fleet of oil tankers. And again, there's more of those oil tankers sanctioned again. So unfortunately, we've been too predictable in terms of rolling out, too slow, too predictable. Sanctions by the highest common denominator. There's always some excuse, some reason not to do different ones, and lobbying by big business or different countries to kind of reduce the impact on them. So unfortunately, it's pretty much the same. It was interesting. I think a French minister suggested these were like seismic sanctions. They're not. They're incremental.
Is there, to an extent, is that sometimes within the nature of sanctions, though, in that you're playing a game of cat and mouse, or is there really a lot more that Europe should be doing here?
Well, there's plenty they should be doing. I mean, look, sanctions are a complex business. I mean, there's always a desire to hurt the target of sanctions more than yourself, your own economy. There's a desire, obviously, not to create systemic risks to global markets and individual markets, right? So you do a lot of homework on them, and now the UK, Europe, and the Americans, they have huge sanctions teams, right? I think the fundamental problem, I think, is still that the collective West still hasn't really accepted the scale of the threat from Russia, right? And if this threat is so large, you have to be willing to pay a price. There's sanctions are not cost free, right? They hurt Russia, they hurt you and some of your businesses in some countries, right? They inevitably will, right? So you have to be able to accept that. But it's a question, what's the scale of the risk from Russia, and what's the cost to you, and like you balance those two off. It's like a cost benefit of these two. I would argue that the cost of not addressing the threat from Russia is enormous. I mean, it's interesting that we've been through a NATO summit. We've had all the focus on increasing defense spending from 2% of GDP to 3.5 and this 5% target. I mean, the fact that we have to go from 2 to 5, right? Now, let's just imagine what that is. So each 1 percentage point of GDP in the European context is about $370 billion, right? So if we go from 2 to 5, That's an extra $1 trillion more defense spending in Europe because basically over the last decade or so we haven't countered the Russian threat and taken the Russian threat seriously, right? So, we're going to have to spend $1 trillion more every year on our defense spending because we've not been serious about the Russian threat and we've not, taken, we've not increased our own defense spending to counter it. We've not helped the Ukrainians. We've not imposed sanctions, all that kind of thing. So again, that's the kind of trade-off, right? Because we haven't been willing to impose significant sanctions that impose something of a cost on us. We're going to have to pay $1 trillion a year in extra defense spending, right? I mean, that's unfortunately, our politicians have not been very good at strategic thinking.
Well, speaking of that strategic thinking, how do those European sanctions stack up, do you think, compared to the proposed or threatened American sanctions? Obviously, there's two sides to it. There's the bill that was going through the US political system that was up to 500%. Trump has suggested something similar in 50 days' time, although he said it would be more like 100% tariffs on countries buying Russian oil. What should we make of those, especially compared to Europe's sanctions?
Well, on paper, 500% tariffs, secondary tariffs on countries importing Russian energy and commodities, it would stop the Russian economy. It would absolutely crash the Russian economy because the only export commodities, it's like 80% of export revenues are commodities, right? And no one would be able to afford to buy those exports. I mean, the problem is with that, unfortunately, that it clearly will cause a lot of disruption to global markets, right? Russia is, I think, about 9-10% of global oil exports, so there'll be a significant energy price shock, oil price shock, if that happens. I mean, I think the idea, the 500% tariff idea, is it's all part of building leverage on Putin. We're serious. We're threatened to do this. Come to the negotiating table. It's two pronged, right? It's arm Ukraine and increase the threat and risk of sanctions. The problem is Trump has already undermined all that, right? I mean, first he kind of stalled. He got his friends in Congress, Graham, etc., to slow pace the rollout of agreements on that particular bill. I mean, it has bipartisan support in the Senate. I think 80 out of 100 odd senators support it, but I think it needs House support to actually get on the statute book, right? It's really, and basically the Republicans, the MAGA guys control that, and there was no signal from the Trump administration they wanted to push through. And then we have this undercutting of the 500% tariffs by Trump announcing 100% tariff idea in a 50-day kind of window. I mean, why 50 days, right? Why does he need 50 days? I mean, previously it was like 2 weeks. Everything was 2 weeks. Now it's 50 days. I mean, it sends a very weak signal to Russia, right? And actually, global markets, if global markets thought it was at all possible that these sanctions would be rolled out, oil and commodity prices would be significantly higher. And actually, on the day of the announcement of 100% tariff or prospect of 100% tariff, oil prices dropped. So actually, the market was relieved that they weren't going to get a 500% tariff. The worst case was 100% tariff. And actually, given the 50-day kind of timeline, people just didn't think Trump was serious about it, right? And the Russians, I think, they were laughing in the Kremlin about this prospect.
And if those sanctions did come in, and we've heard from China that they've said, although not announced this publicly, that they won't let Russia lose this war. How far do you think they are willing or able to continue supporting Russia, even if that's just economically rather than militarily?
Well, the Chinese feel comfortable. I mean, they're making money, frankly, from Western sanctions on Russia. I mean, they're buying, they're looking at Russia's vulnerability and weakness, and they're cutting cut price deals for the import of Russian energy. They quite like the fact, I think, that the war goes on longer. It weakens Russia. Ultimately, the Chinese, don't mind a weaker and more dependent Russia. And they certainly don't want Russia to lose the war. At the same time, I think we've seen messaging also in Europe and the Chinese. They quite like the fact that Europe and the West is kind of as involved and stuck supporting Ukraine in this war. So they've got the Russians and the West all at loggerheads over Ukraine, both spending lots of money on defense, etc. While they get on and focus on their economy, right?
And if these sanctions came in, do you think China would be prepared to try and bust those sanctions or circumvent them? The 500% oil tariffs, that is.
Well, again, it's one of those questions. I mean, would Trump really want to? I mean, the number one relationship of both China and the Americans is this bilateral relationship, right? Would Trump really want to screw that relationship with globally systemic impact and by imposing 100% tariffs or even 500% tariffs on Chinese imports of Russian stuff? I think it feels a bit unlikely, right? So that's why the markets are not really pricing this. They just don't think this is a serious threat.
And of course, on the other side of that threat from the US is this plan for European nations to buy weapons from America to then give to Ukraine. Can Europe match the sort of contributions the US was previously giving in the previous Biden administration? And is this any more secure of a way of doing things? Does it make it less likely that America can just pull the cord again?
Well, money shouldn't be a problem for Europe, right? It's a $27 trillion economy. Russia is a $2 trillion economy, right? So Europe, if it's serious about its own defense, should be able to find the money to support Ukraine and buy weapons for itself and for Ukraine from the Americans to help us and Ukraine defend Europe, right? I mean, the problem is not necessarily finance. The bigger problem is simply the kid is made by the Americans. We don't have a large military industrial complex. We spent the peace dividends. We simply don't have the factories to build to make all this stuff, and the Americans do, right? Patriot missiles, HIMARS, all these kind of things. It's all from the US, right? We're overly dependent on the US for military technology. That needs to change. I mean, I think one of the conclusions from the Trump presidency is, we need to have Europe needs to have a more autonomous defense capability. The UK, I think, needs to have a more autonomous from the US defense capability. We're too dependent in terms of the F-35 program, in terms of the nuclear deterrent, in terms of what the kit to support the nuclear deterrent we get from the Americans. Yes, so I mean, we need to diversify. I think that's a big conclusion from all this. But I mean, on the money issue, there is a moral question. Really, that why should Western or European taxpayers be paying for all this when we have Russian taxpayer money in our jurisdictions? And we've spoken about this before, right? I mean, we got $330 billion of Russian taxpayer money in Western banks in the UK, in France, in Belgium, in the US, and it's just sitting there doing nothing. And there is a legal basis to take it and use that instead of our money, our taxpayer money, and we could use that to fund our own defense. We could move. I mean, there's obviously in the UK there was this big, debate about going from 2 to 2.3% of GDP defense spend, and we raided the foreign aid budget to do it. We've got about 30 billion quid of Russian money, central bank money now in UK banks. That would have gone a long way to helping us, again, moonshot our own defense spend and not hit the foreign aid budget. Why did we not do that? I mean, it's ridiculous that politicians have not done that.
And of course, in the meantime, Russian airstrikes and attacks on Ukraine have only intensified. How severe do we think the impact of Russian airstrikes will have been on Ukrainian infrastructure and the state and the country itself? Is their economy going to have suffered from this? Can they still produce the things they need to produce just to survive?
Well, it's obviously damaging, but the Ukrainians are incredibly resilient, right? I mean, they figured a lot of this stuff out, right? I mean, a lot of smaller scale energy infrastructure. It makes it, in the old days you'd have a huge power station. I mean, now there's a diversified smaller energy units that it's more difficult for the Russians to kind of take out. I mean, the Trump package. I mean, the previous question you asked actually in terms of the finance to buy kit. I mean, that's a positive, definitely. Right, Europe has finally figured out the way to Trump's heart is through his wallet. Right, massage his ego, give him the big win, tell him, we're going to spend a load of money in the U.S. economy, we're going to create lots of jobs, we're going to buy your kit, and all that kind of stuff. And I think he's figured out, yes, fine, I will sell you the stuff, and that will help Ukraine defend itself. It needs defense systems. It's key vulnerability, and we hear at the moment that Patriot missile systems, the best that the proven during this 3.5 year war. They're going to get more of those, and let's hope they get them pretty quickly.
Yeah, I did want to bring that up actually, Timothy, as something, an interesting development in the conflict at the moment, is how much economics have really come to define this conflict and the support for Ukraine. I'm thinking of the minerals deal, obviously that deal yesterday that's all about buying from the Americans. Um, and how that is also impacting the politics. How crucial has the economics of this war become for the US support, especially?
Well, unfortunately, I think our leaders missed a trick again. I mean, look, you could look at the gift to MAGA and the Trump um, presidential run of us spending our taxpayer money, U.S. taxpayer dollars, being used to fund the war in Ukraine, right? Marjorie Green, all these kind of complaints from the far right in the US. Imagine if way back in the months after the full scale invasion, middle of 22, straight after Russian central bank reserves were immobilized, 330 billion. Imagine if we'd have seized those assets and would have used that instead of Western taxpayer money to fund Ukraine's defense. One, Ukraine may have won the war already, and secondly, you wouldn't have given the far right this kind of gift to say that we're wasting our taxpayer money, right? We're idiots. Absolutely, our leadership are, they're not leaders. They lack leadership because they should have done this, right? Someone needs to say, and actually, Rishi Sunak, he left office, wrote a piece in the FT. Yes, we think, sorry, in the Economist. Yeah, it's a great idea. Well, you were in office, you could have done it. Or Boris Johnson again, similar, said the same thing. Why didn't you do it? You give lip service to the idea. It just needs one country to put the head above the parapet and do it, and no one's been willing to do that, unfortunately. Again, the legal basis is there for it to be done. The arguments against are very weak, and if we, what the consequences of us dilly dallying on sanctions, in military support, in financial support for Ukraine as the war's gone on longer, and our populations have become weary in terms of supporting this war, and it's allowed more isolationist tendencies and more populist tendencies in some of our democracies to argue against all this, right, and argue in support of Russia in some cases.
And we mentioned there the minerals deal with the US. One of the key people in getting that minerals deal through is now just been announced is going to become or has become the Ukrainian Prime Minister. What should we expect from her in that role, do you think?
Well, she's well respected, particularly in the US. She's seen as a reformer, young, quite dynamic. She was key, obviously, with the minerals deal with Scott Bessent. I think the Americans trust her. One of the reasons I think she was hired as prime minister, and it comes also as, if you remember, we had on Monday the big announcements about U.S. arms sales to Ukraine. So I mean, it's clever by Zelensky. He's playing to the Trump administration. I guess one of the concerns, perhaps, around the new prime minister is, she's very close to the head of presidential administration, Yermak. Yermak has his critics. There's concern about concentration of power around the head of the presidential administration. There's talk of some infighting within the team, but net, I think she's a positive. It's a positive addition.
Is it still a realistic prospect to you then, Timothy, that those frozen Russian assets could still, because they are still there, like you say, there is that precedent. But do you think it is realistic that it will eventually happen, that a country will stick its head above the parapet, or are we past that point now with the US position being what it is, and Europe setting themselves on spending their own money on defense?
Well, there was some suggestions this week that maybe part of this Trump big announcement on Monday gone was going to be about this, because the US has relatively little in its jurisdiction, right? But again, it would show leadership. Most of the money is in Belgium. $180 billion is in Euroclear, this global depository. If the Americans moved, everyone else would follow, right? And or I think if the Brits or the Canadians or one of those countries did move, also I think the Europeans would follow. There's been a bit of movement. There's more talk about being more innovative in how we use the immobilized Russian assets. We created a facility using the interest stream from them, but at the moment they're invested in a very cautious way, so there's not a lot of interest being generated. You could invest them in higher yielding emerging market debt. If you think 330 billion, you could generate 10% return. That's 30 billion a year. That funds a whole year of Ukraine's budget financing needs, right? So think outside the box. There are solutions. I'm in banking, I'm in finance. We figure out solutions, right? There are definitely solutions. The solutions in terms of the legal case, the investment case, we can find ways around it. And 3.5 years later, actually, all those solutions were detailed in the first 3 months after the full-scale invasion. Our bureaucrats, the yes minister, the computer says no people in UK Treasury and ECB and European treasuries. They've been leading national security policy. That's wrong. Our leaders, prime ministers, presidents, our national security team should be telling treasuries and central banks, get this done. Find solutions. Talk to the private sector like myself. How can we do this? Because our defense and our security and our democracy is under threat, and we have to do this. But again, it takes leadership at the top level. It's lacking. It's sadly lacking, unfortunately.
And certainly, Russia, admittedly, don't think that leadership is there in Europe or in the US. Lavrov came out and just said, "Well, we've had how many deadlines set? We've had how many sanctions put on us? We're still here." Their perspective, or at least what they're trying to project to the rest of the world, is in Russia, is that they can fight forever. Their economy will last forever. They'll find a new way around any sanctions. They'll find manpower from somewhere. Is that true, though? Can Russia, as they claim, just fight on forever? Have they got the economic situation to support a forever war, as it were?
They can fight on a long time, but there are risks. And I think there was evidence late last year that both the Russian and Ukrainian side were willing to talk, right? And Trump had all the cards. Again, I've been on this show before. I've mentioned this, that the Trump presidency had all the cards, right? It could have increased sanctions significantly. It could have increased arms supplies right at the outset, increased the costs on Russia for continuing. And I think that would have forced Russia to the negotiating table. Unfortunately, Trump gave out all the cards away at the outset. He showed weakness to Russia and to Putin. And Putin's a scheming negotiator, right? He saw through Trump. He played Trump. Just think of the leverage we had. There's a NATO membership issue, there's bilateral security guarantee issue, there was increasing arms supplies to Ukrainians, there was security guarantees, there was territory. Steve Witkoff said, no NATO, no bilateral security guarantees. Russia keeps all the territory it has. And then the Russians said, oh, fantastic. How about also demilitarizing Ukraine, which means it's a green light to further invasion. That's what the Russians want. And denazifying Ukraine, which, basically what they mean by that is they want a leadership change in Ukraine. They want a government in Ukraine that follows Russia's instructions, is in Russia's sphere of influence, essentially. And that deal was never, Ukrainians could never accept that deal. That was the end of Ukrainian sovereignty. So Trump's negotiating stance, he was gifted a wonderful hand. He threw it away. And in the end, the two sides are much further apart now than they were, I think, in late 24, early 25.
And how do you judge the way that the Russians have played this then? Because as you say, they seem to be promised almost everything they'd come into this war to get, apart from all of Ukraine territorially. And yet here they are still. I mean, they've now lost, we think, around 1 million men. They're still trying to eke forward in the east, but haven't really made any territorial gains. They've never recovered their initial gains from the start of the war. Was there not a moment where actually Putin had the off ramp and that now seems to be closing?
Well, yes, as I said, the off ramp was at the out. I mean, I think whoever had won the US election, Trump or Harris, either of those would have been negotiating, right? And the Russians and the Ukrainians would be at the table. But the Russians now think, why, if we hang out, we kind of Trump has almost given us much more than we ever expected in terms of the concessions. But if we hang out even longer, we can get everything. And everything for Putin is the whole of Ukraine. He wants the collapse of Ukraine. He wants, he said it. He's written it. He doesn't accept the very existence of Ukraine, right? And maybe he was willing to compromise late last year. Now he thinks I can just wait. Trump's not serious. He'll get bored, and he's more interested in cutting a deal with me than with Zelensky. I mean, and Trump's treatment of Zelensky, the Oval Office meeting, pushing the Ukrainians to give concessions. I mean, all the messaging to Trump is, sorry, Freudian slip. All messaging to Putin is, let's just wait this out. The West will roll over.
Well, Timothy, as much as I don't think you have too much confidence in what's going to happen, or what Trump's claims is going to happen in 50 days, I think we will have to have you back on then to discuss this further. Thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
My pleasure. Good to speak to you.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.